Welcome to our first lesson online for AP Biology. By the way, apologies in advance for any cat noises you hear. They tend to start going a little crazy at times when I'm doing these videos. So today what we are going to go over are some basics of biochemistry. A lot of this stuff should be a review of things from either your freshman biology course or your sophomore chemistry course. So let's get started. There are about 6 elements that make up the vast majority of the human body, and if you want to remember these, there's a pretty helpful acronym. It's CHOMPS. Sorry, sometimes I write crooked. So this stands for carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And if you are looking for the 4 most common elements in the human body, that would be carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are found in most organic molecules. A definition, by the way, of organic molecules are that they're found in living things and that they contain carbon. So all organic molecules contain carbon. If they are inorganic, then they don't meet the criteria above, and a very famous example of an inorganic molecule is water. It doesn't contain carbon, but it is found in living things, but it's not generally found exclusively in living things. Phosphorus and sulfur are found a little less commonly. Phosphorus tends to be found in things like nucleic acids, and sulfur tends to be found mainly in proteins. So, a very brief review of atoms. They are the smallest quantity of an element that displays the property of that element. So they're the basic fundamental units of matter. We are not going to talk about protons. We're really not going to talk much about neutrons. The most important thing for us in biology for atoms is looking at their bonding with other atoms, and that activity of an atom is due entirely to the electrons, specifically the electrons in its outermost shell. So hopefully you remember from chemistry that you have a nucleus in the center, and then you'll have these kind of regular layers in which you will find electrons. So you'll find 2 in the outermost layer maximum. You'll find a maximum of 8 in the next level, 8 in the level after that, and then it gets more complicated. So only the electrons in the outermost shell are going to actually have any effect on the bonding. So those are the only ones we really care about. You're not going to have to do chemical equations on the AP test. They're not going to give you elements and ask you, oh, how many atoms can this bond with? So don't freak out if that gave you problems. There is no stoichiometry on the AP Bio test. One thing to note is that you do have this information sometimes offered to you, which will be an element symbol, in this case carbon. If they give you something like this 12 up here, what that is showing you is that it has a mass number of 12. That has to relate to the number of protons and neutrons, and that's only going to be relevant in one case, which we'll talk about in a moment. Or right now. So a particular element is determined by the number of protons in the nucleus. Neutrons don't change the chemical or physical properties of an element except in one way. Depending on the number of neutrons you have in the nucleus of an atom, it can give it the property of being radioactive. So radioactive isotopes tend to give off both particles and energy, and this can be, most of the time we'll hear about it being harmful, though we do have some uses for radioactivity, both medically and within biology in general. So what I have up here are 3 different isotopes of carbon. Notice that they all have 6 protons, or an atomic number of 6, but what they differ in is their mass number. What this means is that they each have a different number of neutrons. In the case of carbon-12, they have 6 neutrons. Carbon-13 atoms will have 7 neutrons, and carbon-14 atoms will have 8 neutrons. This one tends to be the most radioactive one. It is not stable. It will decay eventually and break down into other elements. And that's going to be useful when we look at the uses of carbon or of radioactivity. So a few medical uses. On the top, what you're seeing is they have probably given this woman radioactive iodine. That's a common treatment if you're treating thyroid cancer, because the thyroid gland is one of the few tissues in the body that will actually take up iodine. So if you want to selectively kill off thyroid tissue because you have a thyroid cancer, then you could give a patient radioactive iodine. It will only be taken up by the thyroid, only kill those cells, and not affect the other cells quite as much. Then at the bottom, what you see is a person receiving an MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. That's one of the imaging technologies that there are a couple. There's MRI, there is CT scanning, and some of those can use radioactivity, naturally found radioactivity, in order to take measurements of the interior of the body. On the right-hand side, what you see is carbon dating. So this is a very common use of radioactive carbon. It's not something that we actively do, it's something that we measure. So if you're trying to judge the age of something very old, what you can do is you can look at the relative amount of carbon-14 compared to other isotopes. So generally, carbon-13 not radioactive, carbon-14 is radioactive and relatively rare. It's taken up by all living organisms. They usually have it in a certain proportion compared to the amount of carbon-12. So if we know the approximate amount they should have had in their body at death, what you can do is use the predictable decay or breakdown of the radioactive element to try and figure out how old it is. If you're interested in this, come talk to me during tutoring, or I can direct you to some videos that will help you out. So the most important thing when we're talking about atoms is how they bond together to form molecules. You're rarely going to find atoms alone in your body. Most of the chemical reactions that are happening are the breaking and the making of molecules. So a compound is a molecule that has at least two different elements bound together. The chemical formula is important because it tells you what's in it and how many of each atom there is. So the chemical formula that you see on here is glucose, which is C6H12O6. You know from looking at that it contains only carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and you also know what ratio it has those in. So chemical bonds are very important for our bodies because they store energy. So when you take in an excess of energy, more energy than you use, your body will store that in chemical bonds in molecules. And then later when you need that energy, your body will break those bonds. That releases energy that it can then use to do work inside your body. Any chemical reaction is either forming or breaking bonds. So there are two ways that atoms can bond to each other. There's ionic bonding. What that means is that basically an atom, in order to be stable, needs a certain number of electrons in its outermost shell. That's what I talked about on the previous slide. If it is a smaller atom which only has one layer of electrons, then its outer shell is full with two. If it is any larger atom than that, then to be stable, it needs to have 8 electrons in the outer shell. There are a couple of ways that atoms can gain this. One way is they can either gain or lose electrons. So metals tend to, for example, let's say lithium. If you do like a diagram where you're showing just the electrons, lithium has 1 extra electron in its outermost shell. So what it does, sorry, I was remembering my periodic table for a moment. What it does is it will give up that electron, and then it will become lithium with 1 less electron. The atomic number for lithium is 3. That means that a normal atom of lithium has 3 electrons. If you get rid of one of those electrons, keep in mind that the atomic number is how many protons are there. You got rid of 1 electron, so now you only have 2 negative charges. What that means is that this lithium now has a positive charge. Let's say you put it in close proximity to a chlorine. Chlorine has 7 electrons in its outermost shell. It needs an extra electron in order to be stable. So what can happen is it can accept an electron from lithium, then it has 1 extra electron, which means it becomes negatively charged. So ionic bonds happen when these 2 ions, so let's say we have a positive ion and a negative ion near each other, they act just like magnets, and so they attract to opposite charges, and that attraction, or that unit formed by a positive and a negative ion joined together, is an ionic bond. The most common ionically bound molecules are going to be salts. They usually exist as solids, but they will very, very easily separate in water or some other polar molecule into individual ions and dissolve into it. And that is going to have a lot of relevance for us later, especially when we start talking about photosynthesis, cell respiration. A lot of cell processes depend on the movement of ions. So let's look at ionic bonding in progress. So we have a sodium atom and a chlorine atom. Chlorine is missing an electron in the outer shell to be stable. Sodium has only 1 electron in its outer shell, and so to be stable, the easiest thing for it to do is give up that electron. So what it does is it donates that electron to the chlorine, and then they become charged. So this turns into a positive sodium ion and a negative chlorine ion, and they can bond together ionically. So here you have negative chlorines, positive sodiums, negative chlorines, positive sodiums, and they arrange themselves when they're in a solid form in a structure where every positive is next to a negative. The other type of bonding is covalent bonding. So covalent bonding is not the exchange of electrons, it is the sharing of electrons. So you can have covalent bonding between atoms of the same type. So the hydrogen gas that's found in the atmosphere and the oxygen gas found in the atmosphere is actually made of 2 atoms of each of those elements chemically bonded or covalently bonded to another atom of the same element. So that's why the gas that we breathe is O2. Notice that you see these kind of shared electrons here. That's showing the covalent bond between them. Since neither atom is willing to fully relinquish those electrons, they share them and thus achieve stability. You can have also compounds like methane, which has 4 hydrogens and a carbon, and notice they're all sharing so that they all have stable outer shells. Because hydrogen only has 1 shell, it's going to have 2 to be stable, and carbon has 4 in its outer shell, so it needs 8 to be stable. So it picks up those 4 from the hydrogens it's sharing with. Now, a nonpolar covalent bond means that electrons are shared equally. There's no uneven distribution of electrons. Therefore, they have no net charge. So nonpolar molecules are uncharged. All of the molecules shown on this slide are uncharged. Let's talk about polar molecules. So this was a subject of a bell ringer. Electronegativity is a property of an atom, and it refers to how strongly it attracts electrons. One of the more electronegative atoms that we're going to talk about is oxygen. Oxygen is highly electronegative. That means that it is going to keep the electrons in its outer shell. Any that it's sharing with another atom, it is going to keep them around the oxygen more often than they are around the other atom. So because of that, and because electrons are negative, oxygen atoms in a lot of bonds will tend to pick up a slight negative charge. This is most common when you have oxygen bound to hydrogen. Oxygen is very electronegative. Apologies, cat noises. Hydrogen is not. So what will happen is, apologies, let's redraw that. You have an oxygen and a hydrogen bound to each other. The oxygen will keep the electron that it's borrowing from the hydrogen more often and pick up a slight negative charge. The hydrogen will pick up a slight positive charge. Overall, it's uncharged. It's got these charged regions. So we don't represent those charges with a full positive or full negative sign. Instead, we tend to use a kind of S sign to represent that partial charge. So if you see that symbol, that means that you are looking at a partial charge and you're looking at a polar molecule. The most common, the most important polar molecule that we'll talk about is water. So speak of the devil. Water, because of its polarity, is able to form something called a hydrogen bond. Now, water is not the only molecule that's capable of forming a hydrogen bond, but the hydrogen bonding between individual water molecules gives it a lot of properties. And water is absolutely essential for life as we know it. So here is that partial negative symbol that I was talking about and partial positive symbol. So notice that you have these kind of slightly charged areas on a water molecule. The oxygen, like I said, is kind of partially negative. Together, the partial negative of the oxygen and the partial positives of the hydrogens cancel each other out, which is why the molecule as a whole is not charged. So the slightly positive hydrogens tend to be attracted to the slightly negative oxygens, almost like really weak magnets. And when they are interacting with each other and kind of stabilizing each other with this bonding, that forms what's called a hydrogen bond. Now, hydrogen bonds individually are very weak. They are not going to hold molecules together. They're nowhere near as strong as a covalent bond. However, if you have a lot of hydrogen bonds formed between, say, two large molecules, that can actually be strong enough to keep those molecules together. The best example of this is going to be, I'll see if I can get this to draw right. Nope, still looks kind of crappy. That is DNA. If you remember, if we zoom in at this area right here, what we're looking at is two nitrogen bases. These two nitrogen bases are not covalently bound to each other. Instead, they are attracted to each other by hydrogen bonds. Each individual hydrogen bond is very weak, but a single DNA molecule will have thousands of hydrogen bonds holding it together, and that helps keep its three-dimensional shape intact. Hydrogen bonding is also really important in proteins as well, and we'll talk about that in more detail in another lesson. So, because water molecules are highly attracted to each other by this hydrogen bonding, they have a few properties, one of which is a high heat capacity. Water stores heat and energy very well. You may notice this if you are in a swimming pool, for example. It's really hot outside, but it feels much cooler when you get into the water. That is because water can absorb a lot more heat without changing its temperature. That's why it tends to feel cooler. The temperature of water will not change very quickly. This is really important for organisms that live in the ocean, so marine or freshwater organisms. Because they live in water and the temperature of water stays more constant than the temperature of, say, the air, they are used to a much narrower range of tolerance. So if you change, let's say you have a fish in a tank, and if you change the temperature too much, it is much more likely to die than, say, if you put an insect or a reptile under the same changed temperature conditions. Also, part of the reason why our temperatures are able to be maintained fairly constantly is due to the massive amounts of water in our body. It's helping us maintain homeostasis by absorbing heat without changing temperature. So, for example, here is the amount of heat that you are putting into some water, and here is how the temperature changes. So notice that you've got a lot of heat being added to solid water, which is ice. When it transitions from solid to liquid, that's adding calories, adding energy, but the temperature is not changing. Notice liquid water. the temperature doesn't change very much. On the other hand, if you had something like rubbing alcohol on here, the temperature change would be much more dramatic. And that is a property of water that organisms use a lot. So what you see on this slide is you see an elephant using water to cool itself. That is also because when water evaporates, that absorbs a lot of energy, and that takes heat off of your skin. So the reason why you sweat is because the water, when it evaporates, takes heat away with it. In this graph, you can see it takes about 540 calories worth of heat. Another property, two properties of water, is that it can adhere and cohere. These two properties are adhesion and cohesion. Cohesion, if you think about it, co means together. And so that kind of helps me remember the fact that it's two water molecules bonding together or sticking together. So cohesion is the ability of water molecules to be attracted to each other. And that's all due to that hydrogen bonding. Because of this, when you're pouring water, the water pours freely. So you start pouring and the water will flow in a continuous stream. It also allows for a property called surface tension. So if you've ever seen something floating on the surface of water, you can do this with staples. Sometimes you can get this to happen with paper clips, but you stick something on the surface of water and it will not sink because water is so attracted to it, other water molecules, that the force of them trying to be attracted to each other is stronger than the force of gravity trying to pull an object down. Adhesion is the tendency of water to be attracted to other polar surfaces. So when you have polar molecules mixing with water, they'll be attracted to it. This is responsible for something called capillary action. Basically, if you have a small tube, and this has to be like a super thin tube, I'm talking something with maybe a whole millimeter in diameter, and you stick it in some water, water will start to actually rush up that small tube because it adheres to the walls of that tube, which are slightly polar, and it pulls water along behind it because of the cohesion of water. This helps with transport of water in plants. It's not the only factor, but it does aid. When water evaporates, it absorbs a lot of heat. That is basically going to help organisms cool when they have water evaporate from their surface. Try it when it's really hot, splash water on your face, and as it evaporates, you'll feel a little cooler. Note, this doesn't work if it's humid outside. Water is the universal solvent. We call it that because a lot of different substances can dissolve in water. It can dissolve anything that's ionically bound or anything that's a polar covalent molecule. We have a couple of properties that refer to the ability of something to mix with water. If something is hydrophilic, it will dissolve in water. That root word, philic, literally means to love. I don't know if you know, but Philadelphia is literally, the meaning of that city's name is City of Brotherly Love. The reason why they call it that, the phila part, stands for love. Delphos was like an ancient Greek word for brother. So literally Philadelphia means love of brothers or loving your brothers. Hydrophobic molecules, on the other hand, tend to be nonpolar. They have no charge whatsoever, and because of that, they do not dissolve well in water. A way to remember this is phobic means fear. So if you have a phobia of something, you're afraid of it. You can almost think of it, if you want to personify them, as these molecules having a phobia of water. So this is just showing you how water dissolves ions. Notice that since it's got both positive and negative charges, it can be attracted to positive ions like this sodium right here and negative ions like this chlorine right here. So that is why water is very easily able to dissolve ions, dissolve salts, and those ions then separate and can move more freely through the water. The density of water changes when it goes from solid to liquid. So when you're looking at ice, the reason why ice floats when you put it in a glass of water is because it's less dense. Anything that's less dense tends to rise in a fluid. Well, that's because the hydrogen bonding of the water molecules makes them form this regular crystal pattern. In fact, you might notice that this crystal pattern forms like a hexagon. That's actually why snowflakes tend to have hexagonal-based structures. Liquid water, on the other hand, because it has more energy, it breaks up those hydrogen bonds, and the water molecules tend to condense more together. Because of that, they get more dense. The reason why this is important is because since ice floats on top of liquid water, when you have aquatic environments, like say a pond, when it turns into winter, the ice freezes, floats at the top, and then it helps insulate the bottom layers. Most other substances, when they are solid, are denser than when they're a liquid. So let's say you had something else. So we're going to call this not ice. Once it's solidified because it froze, it would sink to the bottom. And then the top layer would freeze and sink to the bottom. And then the top layer would freeze and sink to the bottom, and the top layer would freeze and sink to the bottom, and eventually you'd have a solid chunk of not ice. The whole thing would be frozen solid through, nothing would be able to live in it, and probably, if it's a deep enough body of water, or a deep enough body of not ice, then that thing might never fully thaw. So if it weren't for the fact that ice is less dense than liquid water, we wouldn't have anything living in oceans, lakes, ponds, any of that. And considering life first developed in the water, that would have been a problem. Another thing with water is that water, since oxygen atoms are so darn electronegative, they sometimes will attract the electron that they're sharing with hydrogen so strongly, they'll rip it right off of that hydrogen. When that happens, you get this. So water will turn into some hydrogen ions. Actually, it'll turn into one hydrogen ion and an OH. The oxygen is not willing to, it's not strong enough to pull the electron off both of those hydrogens. It can pull it off of one. Notice the hydrogen now has one less electron, so its charge becomes positive, and the hydroxide or OH group has one extra electron, so it becomes negative. The reason why this is important is, one, we're going to talk about hydrogen ions quite a bit when we start getting into some cell processes, especially photosynthesis and cell respiration. Hydrogen ions are found in any type of water. Pure water has hydrogen ions in it as well. Just tends to have an equal amount of hydroxide ions. This reaction, by the way, is completely reversible. So in any particular collection of water molecules, you'll have some that are spontaneously forming these hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions, and then you'll have some hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions that will combine back together and form water molecules. Now, the reason why this is related to acids and bases is because acids will release hydrogen ions when they are dissolved in a solution, and so we say that when you have more hydrogen ions in a solution than hydroxide, it becomes acidic. The lower the pH, meaning any pH between 0 and 7, the more acidic a substance is. So if you had something with a pH of 0, that would be extremely acidic. That would be very dangerous. The pH scale also goes above 7. It goes from 7 to 14 as well, except on that side of the pH scale, you either have substances that will absorb hydrogen ions or they will release hydroxide ions. This is never more obvious than it is in sodium hydroxide. Notice it's got hydroxide ions in it. When it dissolves in water, those get released, they separate from the sodium ions and dissolve in the water, and that makes it a more basic solution. Bases are just as dangerous to living tissue as acids. Acids and bases can be found, more acidic substances and more basic substances can be found in various parts of living organisms. We found ways to make acids and bases work for us. This diagram is really a good thing to look at and read. Maybe pause the video here because it does show you some of the common pHs of certain items. So for example, your stomach acid has a pH of around 1. It is a very strong acid. Your body uses that because that highly acidic environment will lead to the breakdown of molecules, and that helps you digest your food. On the other hand, you have things like tomatoes or lemons. They might also have higher acidity levels as well. Lemon juice is likely acidic in order to try and deter animals from completely eating the lemon fruit, so that way its seeds will not get broken up by some animal's teeth. Pure water has a pH of 7. It's pretty rare to get that. You really have to purify the living daylights out of your water to get that. Human blood has a pH of between 7 and 8. It's slightly basic. You'll notice that if you take a stomach antacid, let's say you're getting heartburn, an antacid, when you combine an acid and a base together, they neutralize each other and make water. So for example, if you ever spill hydrochloric acid on yourself, if you have very easy access to a base, it's better to try and neutralize it with a base. So if you get hydrochloric acid on yourself, wash it off first. But let's say you spill some hydrochloric acid on the floor and you want to clean it up, rather than just wiping it up with a paper towel and potentially getting some on yourself, you might put some baking soda on it to help neutralize the acid. So I showed you an example on the previous page, previous slide, of a reversible reaction. These are reactions that can go in either direction. So they are usually represented with this symbol, where it's like half an arrow going forward, half an arrow going back. You see it again in this diagram. And so this reaction, basically you can have N2O4 break down into NO2. You can also have NO2 combined to make N2O4. So since both of those reactions are possible, we say this is a reversible reaction. Your body tends to use this to manipulate some chemical reactions. So for example, let's say your body wanted to make a bunch of N2O4. So it wanted a bunch of that. What it would do is it would then start pumping NO2 into whatever chamber this is. When there's more NO2, that tends to drive the reaction more strongly towards the side that's making N2O4. On the other hand, let's say that you need to make NO2. Well, then what you would do is you'd start taking out the nitrogen dioxide. That would then drive the reaction in the opposite direction and promote the production of NO2. This is something that your body can do without having to put the energy in to make those molecules. Instead, just the energy it needs is just to transport those molecules from one compartment to another. So, reversible reactions are also very helpful with something called buffers. Buffers are chemicals that can either absorb hydrogen ions or release hydrogen ions, or the opposite, they can absorb hydroxide ions and release hydroxide ions. It's usually a weak acid and the base that it's called a conjugate base. So for example, like sodium hydroxide and hydrochloric, when you combine them, will make NaCl and water. You could reverse that reaction and start making NaOH and hydrogen chloride. But buffers exist naturally all throughout our bodies. For example, there's a very well-studied buffer system in your blood. It maintains your pH at that slightly basic pH, a little bit above 7. And this is necessary because your molecules that make up your body, especially your proteins, have to be at a certain pH, have to have a certain concentration of hydrogen ions in order to be able to function properly. With a pH that's too high or too low, they will start to come apart. They will not be folded into their proper shape. They won't be able to do their job, and that's when you start getting sick. So what happens is these buffers are just molecules that are floating around in your blood. Let's say something happens and it starts pumping hydrogen into your blood. So that means you start adding hydrogen and more hydrogen what will happen is that will push this reaction towards the left, and that will form that bicarbonate, H2CO3. On the other hand, let's say you have something taking hydrogen ions away and raising your pH, then that would drive the reaction to go towards the right and produce hydrogen. This happens without the body having to use any energy, which is really efficient. Your body is designed to use energy as efficiently as possible, whenever possible, so that it has an evolutionary advantage over other organisms. So this is the end of our lesson for today. Feel free to subscribe. You do not have to like. If you subscribe, you'll get notifications when new videos are posted. Other than that, later.